All right, so you decided to start a podcast. You've come up with your minimum plan to launching your podcast, and now it's time to clearly define the why behind your podcast. For me, I feel like there's four types of whys that you should focus on before starting your podcast and really deep dive and think deep about it, because it's going to be something that is harder to change later, and it's good to put extra thought into it now so you can be more aligned with it long term. The first one is, why do you want to start a podcast? Like, what are you going to get out of doing your podcast? For me personally, my why is self-development. So I wanted to get better at communication skills. I wanted to be better at being vulnerable. I wanted to be better at being authentic. And I felt like doing a podcast could help be part of the stepping stones to get me there. So I made self-development a really big reason for why I was doing the podcast. And I think that you should just put down all of your ideas on a piece of paper and narrow it down to one. Just come up with that one reason that's the biggest reason for why you want to start your podcast. If you have an interview style podcast, the next one's going to be your guests. So the community that you build, who is it that you're going to bring on as a guest, and why do you want them to be a guest? And try to think big with it if you're trying to be strategic or open opportunities. Who are people that are multiple layers higher than you, and wherever it is that you're trying to be? If you've got a commercial real estate podcast, who's the biggest people in your industry that you could possibly talk to, and why would you want to talk to them, and what kind of opportunities could come up? So put a lot of thought into your guests and the style of guests that you want, and don't be afraid to think really big about it. For me, I narrowed it down to either being an entrepreneur podcast because I've got a lot of entrepreneurial experience, or doing an influencer podcast because I've built a lot of brands for my businesses, but I was always behind the scenes, so I never really shared for myself. So in combination of my desired growth opportunities with the self-development, I decided that I wanted to surround myself by people who are better than me at communicating, at being vulnerable, at being authentic. So I went straight to trying to talk to the best, and that's influencers. So I was very strategic in my decision of why I chose influencers to interview for my podcast. And I think that whatever your topic is, I think it's important that you put a ton of thought into who the ideal guest is for your show and why you want them to be a guest. The third why that I want you to focus on is the listeners. And this is going to be the community of people that you create. You're going to be surrounding yourself by certain people with the guests that you bring on, but you're also going to surround yourself by sort of a different type of people who are going to be your listeners. For me, I bring on these large influencers as guests on my podcast, but then the community of listeners are usually of the smaller influencer or the aspiring influencer, or people that are trying to overcome barriers to start sharing. So it's more of the people in the earlier stages of their influence as opposed to very established into their influence. And maybe later it'll merge more, but that's what I'm seeing. And I think it's important to distinguish the difference between who the ideal guest is, because those may be people who are levels above where you're at, and then who the ideal community is, which may be someone who is where you're at, or maybe even before where you're at. And sometimes they're above where you're at, which is fine, but the bulk of them are more likely to be at or lower of where you're at. So I think it's important to put a lot of thought into who those listeners are, why you want them to be your listeners, what kind of impact do you want to have on them, things like that. And then the fourth why I want you to deep dive and think about is the opportunities. So what kind of doors do you want to open as a result of doing your podcast? I didn't expect to be having influence on the guests that I bring on the show, but I've had guests that have had millions of followers or millions of listeners and not think of themselves as people that have these large communities or have the capacity to have this impact, or maybe to help them level up their thinking of how they're approaching it. And I'm finding that as bringing people on and deep diving into their story, I've been able to help a lot of my guests think much bigger with what it is that they're doing, or to have a different perspective, which is actually impacting them. So you're impacting the guest, you're impacting the listeners, you're impacting yourself, and then you're going to be having opportunities arise. And with podcasting, you don't always know what those opportunities are. So it's just good to have open doors and open mind with that, but maybe list down some opportunities that you would like to happen and put those as your whys for why you want to do the podcast. For me personally, because I was so focused on self-development and surrounding myself by these influencers, I put less thought into the opportunities because I felt like opportunities would just sort of arise organically. And I have got my businesses that can provide me with income, so I don't have to worry about this podcast having to generate money for me. So if you're in a situation where you need to make money, I think putting more emphasis on the opportunities is important. But for someone like me, it's not as important to be putting the focus on how am I going to make money out of the podcast, because I'm making money from somewhere else. And the podcast is sort of a passion project for me. Again, it's really important to clearly define these whys before starting your podcast. So take a piece of paper, data dump all your thoughts, or do it in a Word doc, or do it in a mind map, whatever your method is for extracting ideas, and figure it out. In summary, you're going to want to come up with a why for you. So why do you want to start the podcast? Why for the guest? Why do you want the guests to come on your podcast? Why for the listener? Why is the listener going to spend the time to listen to your podcast? And then why for the opportunities? What kind of opportunities do you want to get as a result of your podcast, and why? So once you do that, I think it's time to go on to the next video in the tutorial series, which is episode flow. So we'll be talking about all the considerations that you should be thinking about in regards to the episode flow for your podcast. But before doing that, you really need to know your whys. So put some time into your whys and then move on to the next video in the series. A lot of podcasters are creating online courses on how to start a podcast, and I'm creating this content and sharing it with you for free. The only thing I ask for is engagement. So please just hit the like button, leave a comment, and maybe check out my podcast if it sounds like something that's interesting to you. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video where we talk about episode flow. Thanks.